There are few moments in the civic life of a small English market town that so perfectly illustrate its character as the annual flower show. In Flaxborough, though no one would ever admit the possibility of pride, attendance at the event was quietly considered a mark of belonging, while absence, unless explained by illness or a confirmed trip to Weston-super-Mare, suggested either dereliction or dissidence. A damp Thursday afternoon in June, therefore, the townspeople dutifully trooped into the assembly rooms where gladioli flared, dahlias sulked, and a local greengrocer's marrow had been arranged on a velvet cushion like some exotic monarch. The faint mingling of damp wool, chrysanthemums, and egg and cress sandwiches produced what might be described charitably as atmosphere. Among the respectable ranks of entrants was Mrs. Winifred Dublin, lately widowed, and thus the subject of rather more attention than her chrysanthemums strictly warranted. She was a woman of 63, given to brisk conversation and an enviable determination to remain part of everything. Her husband, the late Harold Dublin, had left her not only a semi-detached villa on the North Parade, but also a modestly respectable sum in the Midland Bank. It was this combination of independence and accessibility that made Mrs. Dublin both welcome and slightly resented in Flaxborough circles. She was seen chatting animatedly with the vicar's wife at precisely 2:30, near the display of potted fuchsias. 10 minutes later, she had drifted over to the tea urn, where she was observed helping herself to 2 custard creams and remarking, with her customary forthrightness, that the sponge cake looked a trifle unsteady on its feet. By 3 o'clock, she was gone. Not gone in the ordinary sense of having departed with the respectable murmur of farewells. Gone, rather, as though she had been spirited away in the interval between the judging of begonias and the drawing of the raffle. The disappearance might not have been noticed at all had not Mrs. Dublin left behind her handbag, a large, obstinately shiny object that had long been the despair of cloakroom attendants, and a pair of crochet gloves perched neatly upon it. Mrs. Pepin, who regarded the safekeeping of unattended articles as part of her larger civic duty, drew the committee's attention to this fact. "Someone will have to take them home for her," she insisted, not without relish at the implied dereliction. "It is hardly decent for a widow to be wandering the streets without so much as a handkerchief." It was then that the murmurs began. Mr. Hobson, the station-master, was certain he had seen her in conversation with a stranger by the exit. Mrs. Bloxham, who rarely allowed the facts to interfere with recollection, declared that Mrs. Dublin had been pale, very pale indeed, and had muttered something about needing air. The vicar's wife thought she had gone to telephone for a taxi. The chairman of the committee wondered aloud if she might simply have tired of the whole thing and walked home. When an hour had passed, and there was still no sign of her, a small delegation considered it prudent to contact the police. It was in this manner that Inspector Pubright, sitting with the steady patience of one who had long since abandoned any expectation of excitement, received a telephone call from Sergeant Malley. "There's a lady gone missing, sir, from the flower show." Pubright, who was engaged in the delicate task of encouraging his fountain pen to resume cooperation with the inkwell, looked mildly interested. "Mislaid among the chrysanthemums?" "Not exactly, sir. The widow Dublin left her handbag behind. No one saw her go." The inspector gave the matter a moment's reflection, during which a fly landed with faint impudence upon his blotter. "Ah," he said at length, "a vanishing widow. We have not had one of those in Flaxborough for some years." Within the half-hour, Pubright presented himself at the assembly rooms, where the committee, in varying states of indignation and anxiety, awaited him. He listened courteously to their overlapping testimonies, nodding at intervals and producing no more than the occasional small grunt of acknowledgment. At the sight of the abandoned handbag, he peered in without ceremony. Its contents, a purse containing a modest sum, a folded shopping list, a bus timetable, and a tin of barley sugar, were as entirely consistent with Mrs. Dublin as the handbag itself. "You are quite certain," he asked mildly, "that no announcement was made, no sudden illness?" Mrs. Pepin, affronted, shook her head. "Nothing of the kind. One does not leave a handbag unless something untoward has occurred." Sergeant Malley, standing nearby, nodded solemnly, as if handbags were a matter upon which he possessed a deep professional expertise. Purbright's eyes wandered to the tea table, where the sponge cake still wobbled faintly in its dish. "Well," he said, "perhaps we should begin by calling upon her home. It is just possible, Mrs. Pepin, that the lady is there already, though in that event she must have taken with her a degree of agility one would not normally associate with custard creams." This remark, delivered in the inspector's habitual tone of grave politeness, produced a small stir of uncertain laughter. Yet behind it lingered an unease that none of the assembled wished to voice, that Mrs. Winifred Dublin, who had survived bereavement with notable cheerfulness, had now vanished with suspicious suddenness from the heart of respectable Flaxborough society. And in the corners of the assembly room, amid the lingering scent of chrysanthemums and sponge, speculation already flowered far more vigorously than any prize-winning dahlia. By the following morning, the matter of Mrs. Dublin's disappearance had already outgrown the assembly rooms. It had slipped neatly into the bloodstream of the town and was coursing briskly through its veins, enlivening tea-shops, hairdressers, and that narrow band of pavement outside the post office which was universally recognized as Flaxborough's prime site for exchange of intelligence. Mrs. Bloxham, who had a special gift for transforming a seed of hearsay into a full-grown scandal by the time she had crossed the high street, declared with hushed relish that the widow had been spirited away by foreigners. It was a statement made all the more compelling by her refusal to identify which particular nation was involved. The fact that Flaxborough had not seen a foreigner since the Polish optician retired in 1962 only added to the exotic menace. Meanwhile, Mr. Hobson at the station swore blind he had glimpsed Mrs. Dublin boarding the afternoon train to Lincoln in the company of a man wearing a bowler hat. Pressed for details, he admitted that the fellow might equally have been wearing a trilby, and that his certainty rested chiefly on the fact that he had been looking suspicious. At the greengrocer's, speculation took a more practical turn. Mrs. Dublin, the proprietor explained confidentially to a row of cauliflowers, had very likely done a bunk with the insurance money. It was, he added, what any woman of sense would do once freed from the encumbrances of matrimony and marrows. By elevenses, the town was split neatly into three factions: those who believed the widow had fled, those who believed she had been abducted, and those, chiefly in the snug of the King's Head, who maintained she had merely grown tired of chrysanthemums and gone to stay with a cousin in Cleethorpes. Inspector Pubright, for his part, listened to all this with the grave equanimity of a man accustomed to the unruly growth of rumour. He and Sergeant Malley had called at Mrs. Dublin's villa on North Parade the previous evening, finding it dark, quiet, and stubbornly ordinary. The milk bottles were in their place, uncollected. The letterbox yielded nothing more sinister than a circular concerning window cleaning. Neighbours had seen nothing unusual beyond Mrs. Dublin's brisk departure for the flower show in the early afternoon. By noon the next day, Pubright had already received 2 telephone calls from well-meaning citizens offering information. One was from Mrs. Pepin, who hinted delicately that she had always found Mrs. Dublin a touch too fond of male company and recommended inquiries in the direction of the golf club. The other, less delicately, was from a certain Mr. Broom, who declared the whole affair to be a scandal of civic mismanagement and insisted it was high time someone looked into the goings-on of the borough council. The inspector thanked both with equal politeness, recorded neither with undue emphasis, and went out for his lunch. It was during the course of that same afternoon that the gossip acquired an unexpected vigour. A child, fishing for sticklebacks in the sluggish waters of the canal, returned home with a tale of having seen a lady's shoe floating near the lock gates. Within half an hour it had become 2 shoes, then a whole handbag, then, by the time it reached the ears of Mrs. Bloxam, half a body. A constable was dispatched to the canal. What he retrieved was a discarded boot of the sort favoured by agricultural labourers and a plastic bag containing potato peelings. These, though less than thrilling, did nothing to discourage the town's appetite for invention. By evening, the snug at the King's Head was ringing with speculation of a far darker nature. If the widow had not fled and had not been abducted, then, so the reasoning went, she must be lying at the bottom of some ditch or cellar. The theory gained further credence when someone remembered that she had once quarrelled with her neighbour over the height of a privet hedge. Through it all, Inspector Pubright maintained the same calm, courteous demeanour, receiving reports, asking the occasional soft-voiced question, and betraying no sense of haste. To the sergeant's mind, his superior seemed almost too placid, as if waiting for something to float naturally to the surface of the whole muddied business. And indeed, something did. For that same evening, just as Pubright was preparing to close his office, the telephone rang once more. This time it was not gossip, but a statement of fact. Mrs. Dublin's handbag, the very one left so conspicuously at the flower show, had been seen again. It was spotted, said the caller, not on the cloakroom table of the assembly rooms where Pubright himself had examined it, but being carried, plain as day, by another woman entirely along the high street at dusk. And if that was true, then the mystery of the vanishing widow had just become something very much stranger. The Flaxborough police station was not, in outward appearance, a nerve centre of decisive action. Its brick facade, softened by soot and municipal parsimony, suggested instead a branch library or possibly a laundry of limited ambition. Within, however, Inspector Pubright maintained a steady rhythm of patience which, while seldom swift, had a way of catching up with events sooner or later. On the morning following the curious reappearance of Mrs. Dublin's handbag, in circulation as it were, without its owner, Pubright invited Sergeant Malley to bring in those who might shed a little more light. Malley, who considered interviewing witnesses a form of public theatre in which his role was to strike awe, prepared his notebook with the solemnity of a curate setting up an altar. The first to attend was Mrs. Pepin. She entered the office with the confident air of one who has never doubted her eligibility as a source of civic wisdom. "It is my belief," she announced, before anyone had put a question, "that Mrs. Dublin was not in a fit state of mind on that afternoon. The strain of widowhood, you know, can make one impetuous. I have often said she was too quick with her remarks, though not to her face, of course, since one must show compassion." Pubright inclined his head gravely. "You recall seeing her last?" "Near the sponge cake," replied Mrs. Pepin, with the faintest shudder. "I noted at the time that she seemed disapproving. Perhaps that is significant." Pubright allowed a small silence, into which Mrs. Pepin poured several more opinions of equally forensic quality. He thanked her courteously and suggested she might be asked again should the need arise. Next came Mr. Hobson, the station-master, whose certainty regarding a mysterious man in a bowler hat had only grown firmer overnight. "I would stake my pension," he declared, "that the fellow was not from round here. Shifty eyes, sir, the sort you'd expect to find on a bookmaker or a Methodist." "Did this man speak to Mrs. Dublin?" Pubright asked. "Couldn't say, sir. but I know the look of conspiracy when I see it. She was hurrying, that much I'll swear, as though to catch a train. Since no such journey had been undertaken that day, at least under her own name, Pubright made a small note and allowed Mr. Hobson to depart, flushed with the satisfaction of having contributed a morsel of railway authority to the investigation. By mid-afternoon, the inspector had heard from no fewer than 6 witnesses, all of whom produced statements that contradicted each other with admirable vigour. Mrs. Bloxam insisted Mrs. Dublin had gone pale and whispered about fresh air. The vicar's wife was sure she had seen her move towards the telephone box, while the flower show treasurer declared she had been about to collect her winnings in the raffle. Amid this swirl of recollections, one small detail seemed to interest Pubright more than the others. It came from a shy young man named George Lenton, assistant at the chemist's, who admitted with much hesitation that he had glimpsed Mrs. Dublin outside the assembly rooms after the show. "She was with a lady, sir, not someone I know. A bit taller than her, dark coat, walking quickly." "Did she appear distressed?" "No, sir, only hurried." They crossed the road towards the High Street. Pubright thanked him with unusual warmth and made a longer note than usual. That evening, as the inspector sat alone with his pipe, he reflected upon the curious matter of the handbag. It had been most assuredly left at the flower show. He had examined it himself. Yet now it was paraded along the High Street by another woman, no doubt confident that Flaxborough's talent for noticing would be as efficient as ever. What purpose could such a substitution serve? Was it theft dressed up as disappearance, or disappearance padded by theft? The inspector exhaled gently as though dispersing smoke and speculation alike. Human beings, he mused, were rarely subtle in their designs. More often than not, they blundered through secrecy with the delicacy of a cow in a rose garden. He suspected that Mrs. Dublin's vanishing act was not an affair of high drama, but of some smaller, stickier human motive. And if that was so, then the handbag was not merely luggage misplaced. It was the first stitch in an untidy tapestry yet to be unrolled. It was a settled feature of Flaxborough life that whenever something unusual occurred, the borough council, or some tributary body thereof, was to blame. In the absence of sufficient foreigners, revolutionaries, or communists, councillors offered the nearest approximation to villainy. Thus it was hardly surprising that by the second week of Mrs. Dublin's disappearance, local opinion had fastened upon Councillor Cyril Plumble as the likely cause. Plumble was a man of plump complacency, whose career owed much to his ability to arrange municipal flower beds in the form of Union Jacks and to secure his constituents' refuse collection during a strike in 1959 by personally hiring a horse and cart. To his enemies, who included his wife, he was smug. To his admirers, chiefly himself, he was indispensable. The reasoning behind his sudden elevation to suspect status was, as so often in Flaxborough, both obscure and plausible. Mrs. Dublin, it appeared, had once sat on a committee with Councillor Plumble concerning the town library's heating system. There had been words, strong words, according to Mrs. Bloxam, over the cost of anthracite. And although this had occurred 3 winters previously, it was not beyond belief that resentments lingered. Sergeant Malley, primed by gossip and fortified by a pint of bitter at the King's Head, ventured that Plumble ought to be brought in. Pubright raised his brows mildly. "On what charge, Sergeant?" "Excessive economy with anthracite." "Well, sir, people are talking. They say she embarrassed him, and the fellow's got a temper." The inspector considered this. "Then perhaps we should give him the opportunity to demonstrate it." The opportunity arrived the following afternoon when Pubright, in his most courteous manner, invited Councillor Plumble to the station for a brief and informal conversation. Plumble entered the office with the air of a man expecting either a testimonial or a knighthood, and was visibly discomposed to find instead a wooden chair opposite Inspector Pirbright's desk. "About this business of Mrs. Dublin," Pirbright began gently. Plumble coloured. "Preposterous nonsense, Inspector. My wife and I were at home the entire afternoon. We watched a television programme about border collies." "No doubt a satisfactory alibi," said Pirbright. "Nevertheless, there is the matter of the handbag. You may have heard it was seen in circulation again." "Circulation?" Plumble blinked. "Do you mean to say the thing has taken on a life of its own?" "Not quite. A lady was observed carrying it in the High Street." Plumble shifted, uncomfortably. "Then why bother me? I have never borrowed a widow's handbag in my life." There was, in fact, no evidence whatsoever linking him to it. But Pirbright's serene manner encouraged verbosity, and in due course Plumble delivered a long defence of his character that contained several irrelevancies about council subcommittees, a grievance regarding the borough treasurer's fondness for golf, and finally, almost as an afterthought, a remark about Mrs. Dublin's scheming nature. "Scheming, councillor?" "Well, ambitious," Plumble corrected himself. "She wanted to push through that heating system with a new-fangled thermostat. Very costly. Quite unnecessary." Pirbright nodded as if thermostats might indeed conceal the seeds of murder. "And you never saw her again after that?" No, Plumble said hastily. "Never." When he left, puffing indignantly, Sergeant Malley whispered, "What do you think, sir?" "Guilty?" Pirbright smiled faintly. "Of intemperance, yes. Of mismanagement, undoubtedly. But of vanishing widows, not yet." Still, Plumble's outburst had confirmed something more interesting. The word scheming. It was not a term that the inspector had ever heard applied to Mrs. Dublin before. She was direct, yes, garrulous, certainly. But scheming? That implied ambition, strategy, even collusion. Later that evening, Pirbright allowed himself a small stroll past North Parade. The villa stood dark, shutters drawn, the garden prim as though expecting an inspection. He paused by the gate, studying the neat row of milk bottles before turning back towards the station. The town might be content to believe in Councillor Plumble's villainy, but Pirbright suspected the truth lay elsewhere. He was beginning to feel that Mrs. Dublin's disappearance was not the result of sudden violence or temper, but of some quieter arrangement, a business in which handbags changed hands and widows became elusive. And in the polite murmur of Flaxborough, the inspector thought he could almost hear the sound of that arrangement beginning to fray. If there was one thing Inspector Pirbright had learned in his years of policing Flaxborough, it was that the most trifling of details often proved more obstinate than the grandest of theories. One could spend hours listening to earnest declarations of guilt from gossiping neighbours, only to have a single scuffed bootlace or oddly timed remark quietly reveal the truth. The detail in this case presented itself in the form of a bus ticket. It was Sergeant Malley who found it, though not through any design of methodical searching. While inspecting the contents of Mrs. Dublin's handbag once more, largely to reassure himself that he had not overlooked anything exciting, he noticed, tucked in the lining, a small scrap of pink paper. "Local service ticket," Malley reported with the air of one announcing buried treasure. 2p, dated the day of the flower show. Pirbright accepted the fragment, examined it briefly, and said nothing. His silence, however, was enough to encourage Malley into speculation. "Could mean she took a bus, sir, maybe after leaving the show." "Or before," Pirbright replied mildly. The sergeant frowned. "But wouldn't she have walked? North Parade's not more than 10 minutes from the assembly rooms." "True," said Pirbright, turning the ticket over with delicate fingers. "Yet here it is." The triviality of the discovery was not lost upon him. People mislay tickets in handbags all the time, But what struck Pubright was not so much its presence as the oddity of its denomination. 2p. It was the cheapest fare, used almost exclusively for the shortest ride available, a single stop, barely worth the trouble of boarding. Why, he wondered, should a woman of Mrs. Dublin's brisk habits trouble herself with such a journey? He let the question rest in his notebook without elaboration, for he had learned that hasty conclusions were like premature blossoms, attractive but inclined to drop at the first chill wind. That same afternoon, he and Mally made further inquiries along the high street, stopping at the chemist's to thank young George Lenton again for his observation. George, blushing furiously, admitted he had remembered another point. The lady walking with Mrs. Dublin had been carrying a shopping bag, but it seemed oddly weighted, as if with something heavy. "Did you notice what sort of bag?" Pubright asked. "A green one, sir. Canvas. Looked new." Mally scribbled in his notebook with such vigour that the nib squeaked. Pubright, by contrast, only murmured a thank you and departed. The canvas bag detail lodged in his mind beside the bus ticket. One small scrap of paper, one casual glimpse of a shopping bag. Neither amounted to very much, yet together they hinted at some practical errand rather than sudden vanishment. As the inspector walked slowly back towards the station, he allowed himself the faintest of smiles. While the town clamoured for villains in bowler hats and councillors with grudges, it was often in these dull, pocket-sized particulars that truth lay buried. That evening, over a modest supper, he turned the matter over once again. A 2-penny bus ride suggested a rendezvous close at hand, not flight to another town. A new shopping bag suggested preparation, not panic. And Mrs. Dublin's handbag, deliberately left behind at the show, it now seemed, suggested something almost theatrical, as though she wished people to notice her absence. Pubright, puffing gently on his pipe, wondered whether the widow had disappeared at all. With Mrs. Dublin still absent, and her handbag having achieved a kind of independent notoriety, Inspector Pubright considered it time to widen the net of inquiry. Flaxborough was not large, but its inhabitants were plentiful in conjecture, and within that chatter there were always a few grains worth collecting. The first visit of the day was to Mrs. Cribb, the widow's immediate neighbour on North Parade. Mrs. Cribb was the kind of woman who treated all questions as accusations and all answers as confessions, whether she possessed any guilt or not. "I never said a word against her," she began defensively, before Pubright had spoken. "Not since the hedge business, and even then it was her fault for planting it so close to the fence. One couldn't see one's own begonias." Pubright allowed her to talk herself into a circle, listening as she moved from grievances about overhanging branches to suspicions regarding Mrs. Dublin's late-night callers, a phrase which upon inquiry resolved itself into the milkman delivering at 7 o'clock. "Would you say she expected visitors recently?" Pubright asked. Mrs. Cribb pursed her lips. "She was always expectant, Inspector, the type who puts on lipstick for the gas man. Not that I watched, but one notices these things." With this valuable testimony safely recorded, valuable in the sense that it revealed more of Mrs. Cribb's character than of Mrs. Dublin's movements, Pubright thanked her and moved on. The next call was at the golf club, for the more fanciful gossip had fixed upon the possibility of Mrs. Dublin forming attachments there. The steward, a man of perpetual exasperation, assured Pubright that she had not been seen on the premises since her late husband's funeral reception, when she had drunk 2 sherries and declared the sandwiches stingy. "Not the golfing type," the steward concluded firmly. "Too brisk in manner, puts the men off their putting." From there, Pubright turned his attention to the Midland Bank, where the manager, thin and grave as a church candle, confirmed that Mrs. Dublin's account remained untouched since the day before the flower show. "Not even a withdrawal for housekeeping," he said. "We pride ourselves on observing these things." Pubright nodded, outwardly impressed, while privately noting that the absence of financial flight rather weakened theories of elopement or escape. By mid-afternoon, the inspector and Sergeant Malley had also called on the vicarage, where Mrs. Hatchley, the vicar's wife, produced her own contribution. She remembered Mrs. Dublin had asked her a curious question the week before the show. She wanted to know whether our church kept records of marriages back as far as 1900. I thought it odd. She is not, as far as I know, compiling a family tree. And when I said I would inquire, she brushed it off. "No need," she said. "I'll manage elsewhere." This detail, relayed with mild perplexity, interested Pubright rather more than the rest of the day's chatter. It suggested inquiry, purpose, perhaps even research. Certainly not despair. Returning to the station at dusk, he reflected that the portrait of Mrs. Dublin was acquiring shadows that the town's idle gossip had failed to paint. She was lively, yes, perhaps indiscreet, but there was also a streak of curiosity, and possibly a design, behind her bustling exterior. Malley, who had spent the day dutifully filling his notebook with hedge disputes and golf club sandwiches, looked weary. "I don't see we're much further, sir. No enemies, no sign of struggle." "Nothing." Pubright glanced at him kindly. "Nothing, Sergeant, is frequently where the most interesting things are to be found." And as he settled once more to his paperwork, he thought of the bus ticket, the green shopping bag, and the curious business of century-old marriages. Together, they hinted that the vanishing widow might not have been a victim at all, but an architect of something only half completed. For several days after the flower show, the case of the vanishing widow had begun to slip, if not from Pubright's mind, then certainly from the town's attention. Flaxborough possessed an admirable capacity for distraction, and the unexplained absence of one lady, however much she had been given to bright hats and lively greetings, could not compete indefinitely with the dog show, a burst water main in High Street, and the perennial rumour that the council had employed a man to count pigeons at the Corn Exchange. Then came the second incident. It occurred late on a Thursday evening, when the town's shopkeepers were pulling down their shutters and the last bus was rattling towards the estates. Mr. Henry Sprod, a retired auctioneer with a fondness for port and unshakable suspicions of foreigners, was locking his front gate when he noticed a light flickering oddly in Mrs. Dublin's house next door. He would later describe it to police as not steady like a lamp, nor lively like a candle, but more in the way of a torch being waved about by someone with no sense of proportion. Being of stout heart and nosy disposition, Mr. Sprod had crept to the hedge and peered through. What he saw, or thought he saw, was a man's silhouette moving briskly about in the drawing-room. The light snapped off after a minute, and silence followed. By the time Inspector Pubright arrived with Sergeant Malley, summoned via a telephone call that combined urgency with a series of character references against continental electricians, the house stood in utter darkness. Pubright tried the front door. It was locked, bolted from the inside. Windows, too, were fastened. No sign of forced entry, no disturbance. Yet on the carpet of the drawing-room, his torch revealed something that had not been there before, a square of folded paper deliberately placed in the centre of the rug. It was not addressed, merely a plain envelope, slightly creased, containing a single sheet on which was typed, "Do not look for her. She has what she wanted." There was no signature, nor trace of who had handled it. Sergeant Malley, reading it over Purbright's shoulder, gave a low whistle. "Well, sir, that puts a queer face on it. Someone's playing games." "Perhaps," Pubright murmured. He refolded the sheet carefully, as though it were no more than an old hymn leaflet, and returned it to the envelope. But games usually reveal more about the players than they intend. Mr. Sprod, still lingering in his dressing gown at the gate, insisted the man he had glimpsed was tall, possibly with a limp, though it might only have been the awkwardness of torchlight. He repeated this with great solemnity, then added that the figure could equally well have been stooping, in which case the limp was imagination. The following morning the town buzzed anew. The widow's disappearance was one thing, mysterious messages and prowlers quite another. The Flaxborough Citizen produced a headline of unusual vigour. "Shadow in the window, missing widow house intruder." For Pubright, the difficulty lay not in the evidence, but in its neatness. Whoever had written the note wished very much for it to be found, and for its contents to be accepted without question. That, to his mind, was already a reason to doubt them. Still, the incident had broken the case free from stagnation. Where before there had been silence and absence, now there was deliberate communication. As he placed the envelope into the station's evidence drawer, Pubright said quietly to Mally, "Our widow has vanished, but someone, somewhere, is determined she should not be forgotten. And that, Sergeant, may be the most dangerous element of all. Gossip in Flaxborough were a natural phenomenon. It would be recorded in weather bulletins. Scattered rumour heavy in the marketplace, clearing towards evening. Rarely did an event of consequence, or even inconvenience, escape the tongues of its citizens. A lost bicycle could command attention for a fortnight. The mysterious disappearance of a widow, and now the apparition of a stranger in her drawing-room, was the sort of nourishment upon which whole seasons of speculation might be sustained. By Friday morning, the town's cafes and hairdressers were thick with conjecture. The butcher's assistant, whose experience of crime began and ended with a weekly detective magazine, informed his customers that the light seen in Mrs. Dublin's window was clearly a code to smugglers on the canal. Meanwhile, the librarian, a grave woman who distrusted fiction on principle, remarked that it was much more probably to do with those northern industrialists she was forever corresponding with. At the Drapers, a group of matrons insisted the missing widow had been spirited away to Scotland by a secret admirer. They spoke with such certainty that one might almost have supposed they had packed her luggage themselves. Children, too, made their own contribution. A pack of boys on bicycles claimed to have seen a man with a bandaged head loitering near the cemetery gate, while 2 schoolgirls declared solemnly that Mrs. Dublin had become a nun in disguise. Inspector Pubright, going about his errands with studied calm, listened where he could, noting less the details than the manner in which people held to them. It was always useful, he reflected, to discover who pressed a theory with too much insistence, or who seemed oddly anxious to suppress one. Sergeant Mally, less patient, grew weary of the flood of tips that came into the station. One woman telephoned to describe at considerable length the suspicious way her neighbour stirred tea, clockwise, then anti-clockwise, as though it might encode a message. Another produced a long letter describing noises under her floorboards, almost certainly burglars tunnelling to escape detection. "Sometimes, sir," Mally grumbled as he deposited yet another sheaf of information on Purbright's desk, "I think the whole town's been abducted by its imagination." "Not abducted," Pubright said mildly, "merely exercised." Still, amongst the froth of stories, 2 small facts emerged that bore consideration. A shopgirl from the chemist's remembered selling cough lozenges to a tall man with a limp, a stranger to the town, and an elderly gardener swore that he had seen a motor car, dark and unfamiliar, parked outside Mrs. Dublin's house for a short time on the very evening of the supposed intrusion. Neither account could be proved, neither dismissed. On Saturday, the Citizen devoted nearly 2 pages to the matter, accompanied by a rather fanciful artist's sketch of the mysterious visitor. In the drawing, the man appeared to be a cross between a pirate and a city clerk. Beneath it ran the caption, "Who is he?" It was not the sort of publicity Pubright relished, but he understood its inevitability. Public appetite demanded to be fed, and when information was scarce, invention supplied the banquet. That evening he and Mally walked once more past Mrs. Dublin's silent house. Its windows glimmered faintly in the lamplight, and the garden, untended, had begun to sprawl untidily. There was an air, Pubright thought, not of vacancy but of waiting, like a stage before the curtain rises. "Funny thing, sir," said Mally, pausing at the gate. "All this talk, all these rumours, and yet the one person who ought to tell us what's going on keeps her silence." Pubright gave the darkened windows a long, steady look. "Yes, Sergeant," he said softly. "The widow remains absent, but she's present in every tongue that speaks of her. Sometimes that is the more powerful condition." And with that they walked on, leaving the house and the town's restless speculations behind them. It was during the lull of Sunday morning that the first real evidence of deliberate communication arrived at the station. A letter addressed in neat, unfamiliar handwriting to Inspector Pubright, Flaxborough Police Station, lay upon the sergeant's desk like a small, calculated gift. Pubright unfolded it with the careful patience of one handling a fragile manuscript. The contents were brief, typed with mechanical precision, yet their tone carried the unmistakable weight of purpose. "I am safe. You seek answers where there are none. Look instead at what you have overlooked. The smallest detail often speaks louder than the loudest claims. Patience, Inspector, and civility will show the path. E.D." Sergeant Mally leaned over his shoulder. "E.D.? Could it be?" Pubright made no immediate comment. Instead, he allowed the envelope to rest on his desk while he reread the lines, noting carefully the polite imperatives and the subtle challenge within them. Whoever had written this letter wished to control the tempo of the investigation, and to do so with civility. Later that morning, he summoned Councillor Plumble once more, not to accuse, but to observe. The councillor, flustered at having been called for a chat, arrived with his usual air of self-importance and the faintest trace of suspicion in his eyes. Purbright's method was understated. He did not confront, he inquired. "Councillor, did you happen to see a lady carrying a green shopping bag on Thursday evening?" Plumble hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. I cannot say that I did, Inspector. Perhaps a glimpse from the corner of my eye." "Were you at home all evening?" Pubright asked gently. "Of course. My wife can vouch." Pubright nodded. "And yet a neighbour reports seeing a tall man moving in Mrs. Dublin's drawing room. Do you know of anyone who might have been there?" Plumble's face flushed crimson, though he said nothing. "Do not feel obliged to answer," Pubright continued, with the same calm tone he had maintained throughout the investigation. "We are merely assembling pieces of a puzzle. Sometimes the pieces are not where one expects them." By the time the councillor departed, flustered and muttering about ill-mannered constables and newspapers, Pubright had made one quiet observation. The mention of a green bag had unsettled him slightly more than any accusation or gossip. It was a trivial detail, yes, but one he had already catalogued. The rest of the day was spent quietly collating notes, reviewing witness statements, and pacing the station's small office. The letter, Pubright realized, was both a challenge and a reassurance. Someone wished him to follow the evidence carefully and to respect the civility of the town, even as it entertained its less savoury speculations. By evening, he had begun to see a pattern. The bus ticket, the shopping bag, the letter, all hinted at deliberate movement, carefully staged. The widow, it seemed, had orchestrated a vanishing act not out of panic, but perhaps out of curiosity or design. Pubright allowed himself a faint, ironic smile. If Mrs. Dublin was indeed behind the orchestration, she was conducting it with an elegance that made the entire town, a town so skilled in embellishment, look clumsy in comparison. He resolved to test the subtlety of her design. And he knew just the way to do it. A quiet, polite remark, placed deliberately in the right ears to see which ones twitched at the sound. Monday morning brought a gentle drizzle over Flaxborough, the sort that settled comfortably into gutters and the minds of citizens alike. Inside the station, Pubright moved among his papers with habitual calm, while Sergeant Malley fussed over the coffee urn, as if that small act might produce the final answer. Purbright's mind, however, was already engaged elsewhere. The letter, the green shopping bag, the bus ticket, these trifles had begun to form a pattern. If Mrs. Dublin had vanished, it was clear she had done so with forethought, leaving behind clues not in error, but in deliberate misdirection. The test, Pubright decided, needed to be equally deliberate, yet perfectly civil. He began with a casual remark at the King's Head, spoken not to the public at large, but to the ears of a few discreet listeners. "Curious, isn't it?" he mused over his pint, "how small items, a ticket, a bag, can give us more truth than hours of accusation." The reaction was instantaneous, yet subtle. Councillor Plumbold stiffened, nearly tipping his glass. Mrs. Bloxham's eyebrows lifted to a height almost comical, and Mr. Hobson, the station-master, puffed with interest at the mention of tickets. All eyes, without exception, flickered toward the direction of Mrs. Dublin's house. Later, Pubright arranged a small, innocuous meeting with several witnesses, including George Lenton from the chemist, Mrs. Cribb, and a few of the more curious shopkeepers. They were not summoned for interrogation, merely to be present in a polite gathering. Pubright began a quiet conversation about ordinary errands and the virtues of punctuality, observing, as he always did, the tone and manner of those around him. At last, he allowed a deliberate pause and then remarked casually about the lady with the green shopping bag, seen walking purposefully near the assembly rooms. The effect was immediate. One of the group, a young woman who had remained conspicuously silent throughout, shifted uncomfortably. Her fingers twitched, her voice faltered when she replied, and she avoided Purbright's calm gaze entirely. That evening, the inspector visited Mrs. Dublin's villa again, this time with an air of quiet expectation. As they approached, a light flickered briefly in the drawing-room. A woman emerged, smiling gently, and placed a green canvas bag on the front step. "Inspector," she said, as if greeting a neighbour rather than facing an enigma, "I see the town has not been idle." Pubright inclined his head politely. "Indeed, madam, and I think you might have misjudged how attentive they can be to small details." She laughed softly. "I had hoped for a little mystery." "Sometimes," he replied, "the smallest evidence, handled politely, is more revealing than the grandest suspicion." And with that, the test had served its purpose. The deliberate signals, the bag, the bus ticket, the letter, had all been placed to gauge reaction. Through these quiet observations, Pubright had identified the orchestrator. It was not the council, nor the mysterious stranger, nor any hidden adversary. It was the widow herself who had engineered her absence and the town's stir with exquisite subtlety. By Tuesday afternoon, Flaxborough had reached a state of polite impatience. The vanished widow was still absent in the physical sense, yet every shop, café, and lane seemed to pulse with her imagined movements. The townsfolk, in the absence of hard fact, had embroidered stories to a considerable degree. Pubright, however, had long since ceased to be concerned with embroidery. He had reviewed every trivial clue, the bus ticket, the green shopping bag, the typed letter, and the reactions of those whose attention he had quietly tested. he arranged a meeting at the assembly rooms, selecting the venue for its civility and neutral atmosphere. Those assembled included the councillor, Mrs. Cribb, Mr. Hobson, George Lenton, and a scattering of the more curious shopkeepers and neighbours. Pubright stood at the front, his hands folded, his expression that careful blend of patience and mild amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have heard much over the past fortnight. You have observed, conjectured, and in some cases embellished, as is human nature. You have named suspects, imagined motives, and speculated upon movements that were never made. And yet—" He paused briefly, allowing the sentence to settle over the room like a soft, deliberate echo. "The truth is far simpler than any of your theories. Mrs. Dublin is, in fact, neither kidnapped nor in peril. She has orchestrated her absence with a deliberate design, leaving behind a small trail of items intended to provoke curiosity and attention." A murmur ran through the room. Councillor Plumble shifted, relieved yet flustered that he had not been the culprit. "The handbag was left at the flower show intentionally," Pubright continued. "The green canvas bag, the 2-penny bus ticket, and the letter you received, all these were placed with care to observe human behaviour and perhaps to amuse herself in the predictable stir of Flaxborough's society." Mrs. Cribb, who had been muttering about hedge disputes, blinked and said softly, "So, she planned it all?" "Precisely," said Pubright. "And in doing so she has revealed much about human nature. We are inclined to assume the worst, to create villains where there are none. Small details, timed perfectly, noticed attentively, can tell the truth more efficiently than accusation or hysteria." At that moment, Mrs. Dublin herself entered quietly from the side door. She smiled at the assembled gathering, calm and unruffled. "Inspector," she said gently, "I trust I have not caused too much inconvenience." "None that could not be anticipated," Pubright replied with a faint smile. "And in fact, you have provided us with an exercise in observation and patience, a rare lesson in civility." The townsfolk, gradually recognizing the resolution of the mystery, relaxed. There were chuckles, a few embarrassed apologies, and a sense of relief that the vanished widow had been absent by design rather than misfortune. Flaxborough resumed its ordinary rhythms over the next days. Councillor Plumble returned to his committees, Mrs. Cribb resumed her vigilant garden supervision, and the chemist's assistant, George Lenton, found his courage bolstered by having witnessed a little adventure firsthand. And for Inspector Pubright, the case concluded as quietly as it had begun. The widow was accounted for, the town's curiosity satisfied, and the trivial details that had seemed so inconsequential had revealed the truth with elegance. He returned to his office, sat at his desk, and opened a fresh notebook. Outside, Flaxborough moved on, unaware how finely balanced the calm had been, and how thoroughly it had been orchestrated. For Pubright, that was enough.